Hello, everybody. Welcome to Back in the USSR here on 93.3 FM CFRU. And one of the things I really want to do here today is to kind of go back into what I was doing a few weeks ago, and unfortunately it was kind of on hiatus, but I really meant to be coming back to it. And that, of course, is debunking the myths which surrounded Joseph Stalin, of course, the much maligned leader of the Soviet Union during its most spectacular period of growth in the 1930s, 40s, and early 50s. So that's really what I'm gonna talk a bit about today. I know I went into some of debunking some of the myths surrounding the atrocities that he supposedly committed, which were still spread around very much falsely in the kind of like right-wing press, and right-wing historians, of course, propagate these myths. And I talked a little bit about that a few weeks ago when I interviewed Jason Unruh as well, and of course a lot of other myths as well, because we talked about North Korea and China and Cuba and all these other countries that are so demonized by the right-wing press, and various leaders who are demonized by the kind of mouthpieces that try to keep us in the dark about what socialism really is and what it's really all about, by just basically using slander and just false stories and all manner of things, or distorted numbers, and you name it. So we dealt with that last time. What I really want to talk about today, a little later on, is the kind of successes that socialism has actually won they're just covered up and virtually never talked about in the media in general, because really the successes of socialism are so huge. They amount to essentially the biggest lifting of people out of poverty in human history. Like, I'm talking hundreds and hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty, whether that's in Russia or China or Cuba or Eastern Europe or Mongolia or places in Africa and South and Central America, which had socialist governments, whether that's like Nicaragua or Angola or any of these places. You saw a massive lifting of people who lived in desperate poverty, often under colonial governments. And these people are risen up, and they actually can have a decent standard of living for the first time ever. That's huge. And we see this the situation the way it is today, where you have NGO after NGO after NGO, and just constant flow of aid dollars, supposed aid dollars going into these African countries, and yet the standard of living does not go up. And literacy is not eliminated. And these kind of chronic diseases and all these other things that you see in these third world countries are not being eliminated, even though supposedly billions are being spent on this every year. Meanwhile, in these countries such as Cuba, which were the vast majority of the population was illiterate before the revolution of 1959, before Fidel Castro came to power, and the vast majority of people were suffering from disease, had no access to health care, no access to public education, nothing. And within a decade, all those ills had essentially been eliminated. And we compare that, of course, today, where all this aid money, of course, which supposedly is going to help the people of the third world, doesn't do anything, doesn't eliminate any of these problems. I mean, Haiti is one of the most poorest countries in the world. It's like an El Dorado for NGOs, and yet things don't get better. That should tell us something. Meanwhile, you see a place like Cuba, which has had all the problems in 1959 that Haiti does today, and managed to reverse all those problems in about 10 years. Less than 10 years even. Because it had socialism. It had public resources. The resources of that country went towards the well-being of the people, as opposed to the well-being of the ruling class, of the capitalist class who were only interested in their own profit. That's a major, major difference. And meanwhile, you see, of course, in Haiti, all these sweatshop owners, it's like a bonanza for sweatshops right now, as they're all going in there, tapping the cheap labor, mining companies from Canada are going in there to exploit the natural resources and stuff like that. It's not the people who are benefiting. It's not the people who are benefiting from the aid dollars. It's not the people who are benefiting from the foreign investment. It's the ruling class that's benefiting from those things. That's the difference. And meanwhile, you see all the progress, not just Cuba, China or North Korea or any of or the Soviet Union, any of these countries that actually use their resources of their country to benefit their people, as opposed to the interests of a capitalist class only interested in their own profit. Those countries have major advances that are just covered up because, of course, they don't fit the dominant narrative. The communism is supposedly evil. How can it be evil when it raised so many people out of poverty? Like, the biggest raising of people out of poverty in human history. And that's a fact. And that's the same thing with on this show. I'm not afraid to say it like it is. So we're going to just go into this, talk about what the accomplishments of socialism were in the Soviet Union. And because, he talked a little bit about that in this in that clip. I'm going to expand on it. Now, one of the things I talked about when I mentioned Stalin and a lot of the myths spread demonizing him last time, of course, the surrounding collectivization, the collectivization of agriculture in the late 1920s, early 1930s, when private ownership of land was abolished. And you actually had, for the first time ever, socialist communal organization of the land. So like the land essentially became public domain. Worked in the public sphere by people who actually were paid wages and decent wages for their labor. They actually held the land, and it was actually the people who actually owned the land as opposed to like private ownership. So we actually had for the first time ever, the means of production in the countryside were actually owned by the people. So that's socialism. And of course, because this is the first time in history that was ever done, there were a lot of setbacks, there were a lot of mistakes that were made, and indeed there was a famine in 1932-33. And of course, that was an El Nino year as well. That, of course, contributed to that, the weather conditions, which tends to get minimized. So, yeah, there were problems. And this did indeed lead to suffering, but they moved to correct these problems. They sent massive aid to the Ukraine when that famine hit. And they made sure that there was a strong recovery. And then, in fact, even the next year, there was a strong harvest. And they actually got past that. And there never was a famine on that level again, ever, in the Soviet Union. When they had actually developed the infrastructure, they had, fully kitted out the collective farms with tractors and modern machinery and all this sort of stuff. They made sure that, unlike the way it had been in Russia in the past, where there was practically a famine every 5 years or so, where people actually starved to death. Now there would never be that situation again. There would actually be enough food to go around, and they would ensure that would be the case. So that development, that was an immense triumph, Never again would peasants in Russia be reduced to eating clay during periods of famine like they had under the Tsarist regimes in the past. So it was ultimately a success. And beyond that, of course, 5-year plans. There was rapid industrialization. Even Western economists basically gave kudos to the Soviet Union and the kind of economic growth that they had achieved. Where they were growing like hundreds and hundreds of times over, like just doubling and doubling and doubling their production over like the course of just a few years, even. Whether that's like in steel production or in like the production of tractors or the production of machinery or like whatever. Like, just massive strides were being made during this period. Just astronomical economic growth in the 1930s. And an equally astronomical recovery after World War II, when, of course, the country had been devastated. They were even calling the Soviet Union the Red Phoenix because it was just recovering so well. And many Western workers during this period actually went to the Soviet Union and in fact, witnessed these transformations firsthand. So we're not just relying on the account of the Soviet government here on these achievements. It's Soviet citizens, it's like citizens of other countries going to the Soviet Union during these times to work on these industrial projects and to develop that country. Because you had a lot of international solidarity here at that time. All these people can attest to that. And when it came to human services and human development, there was for the first time ever, there was universal health care, housing. Unemployment was eliminated. For the first time ever, everyone was in school. There was universal education, public education, free of charge, even at the university level. Illiteracy was practically eliminated. And to tell you the scope of this kind of transformation, I have to point out, under the Tsarist regime, before the revolution of 1917, upwards of 3/4 of the Russian population were illiterate. Illiteracy was huge. And yet, by the late 1930s, that illiteracy had essentially been eliminated. And it hasn't come back. Even today, and as somebody who's been to Russia, I can attest to this, even today, Russia has one of the highest literacy rates in the world. It's even beyond Canada. It has a higher literacy rate than Canada, and like Russians read all the time. You see them on street corners just reading, on park benches. They do it way more than Canadians do. It seems like always people's heads are buried in books, and so illiteracy was practically eliminated. People who were like originally just peasants now were becoming doctors, scientists, engineers, aviators, generals. So people like Georgy Zhukov, who was one of the most amazing Soviet generals of the Second World War, like defended Leningrad, Moscow, Stalingrad, ultimately was largely responsible for the capture of Berlin and the destruction of the Nazi regime there, based on that. He was a peasant. He was originally of peasant stock. And despite exceptional capabilities, he would never have risen beyond the rank of non-commissioned officer, basically a sergeant in the Tsarist army. Because the upper echelons of the army in those times were reserved for aristocrats. Yet under the Soviet Union, he was really able to shine, and he arose to basically the highest rank in the army and led that army basically to victory in the Second World War. And you see similar stories, of course, like with Vasily Chukov, who joined the Red Army in the Russian Civil War. Like, he was just a peasant, and he was just a teenager, and yet within a few years he was the commander of his regiment, and would ultimately be the one who defended Stalingrad against the Nazis, and would ultimately would win great victories and ultimately head the Soviet Army after the Second World War. So you see these remarkable success stories. It's like people were just able to get an education and raise themselves up to be all that they could be in society. I mean, that was huge. And it happened on a vast scale. And, of course, under Stalin, he was the one, of course, really emphasized education. Like, he had night schools, he had universities that expanded their capacity, and just crash course in school building. And so within a very short period of time, people were actually getting a very, very quality education all across the board. Universal, public, free. And it was just, the transformation of society was just massive. And during this period, living standards were rapidly rising. Life expectancy was growing. Russia, which had originally been considered a very backward third world nation, became essentially an industrial powerhouse and was able to stand on its own 2 feet. And it was no longer a victim of Western economic imperialism as it had been under the Tsarist period. I mean, under Tsarism, essentially, if British and French corporations wanted access to cheap labor, oftentimes they would go to Russia and exploit the cheap labor in the Russian economy. It's very, very similar to American corporations that want cheap labor, so they go to a place like China or India or Thailand or Indonesia or something like that in the modern world. Essentially sweatshop kind of conditions had prevailed there, and it was basically about that. It was basically about cheap labor and exploiting natural resources. That's about it, And a lot of that wealth, of course, was shipped out of Russia, did not benefit the Russian people at all. And, to say under the Soviet Union, it was totally the opposite. Of course, that wealth started benefiting the Russian people. And they got access to that wealth, and they actually were benefiting from the resources of their country for the first time. And so many people were being taken out of poverty. And they were getting an education. They were becoming all that they could be. And it was really an amazing transformation of society, absolutely, gigantic. And during this period, of course, women were making great strides too. They had been emancipated by the Revolution of 1917, given formal equality, but of course, in the Soviet Union, not only was it formal equality, it was actually substantial equality that they won. They made great strides. They entered all manner of professions, doctors, aviators, even soldiers, scientists. The USSR was the only country in the World War II to allow women to serve in combat roles in the military. So Russian women just were enjoying rights unparalleled anywhere in the world at that time. I mean, the West didn't really catch up to the gains made by Soviet women until at least the 1970s. Whether that's to vote or to attain equal wages with men, which they still haven't attained even in Canada, or attending the vote, like, to access to certain jobs. I mean, all these things they were getting, like Soviet women started to get in the 1920s. Access to abortion. It's amazing, like this kind of stuff. They just really, really broke new ground. And of course, if you hear about the kind of stories about Radmila Pavlichenko, of course, the famous Russian sniper, female sniper of the Second World War, killed several hundred Germans during the defense of the Soviet Union. And of course, the women night bomber squadron, nicknamed the Night Witches, who gave the Germans many, many nasty surprises. And like just these women who distinguished themselves in battlefield roles and proved that women could, stand at the same level as men. Even in these professions that have traditionally been viewed as just men's jobs. Even like something like a soldier. So that women could do this. Like that's huge. That broke so much new ground. And just, like it was absolutely massive, this kind of transformation. And up to 1936, homosexuality had been legalized in the USSR, just light years ahead of anywhere in the West. And it was only recriminalized under pressure from the Russian Orthodox Church, during the 1930s. And largely the reason why it was recriminalized, because there was no organized gay movement to push back and to do, to really stand up so that that homosexuality would remain legalized and open and not stigmatized. And of course, one of the reasons why I bring this up, what does that say about totalitarianism in the supposedly totalitarian state in the USSR? If essentially the Soviet state had to give in to the demands of the Russian Orthodox Church on homosexuality. Like what does that say? Quite an example there. Not something a lot of people know about. And so of course the USSR, in spite of incredible losses and suffering, played an immense part in defeating Nazi Germany. A role which is often minimized or challenged in the West. And yet, the Soviet Union suffered 28 million at least, even over 30 million deaths during that war. Far and away greater, just million times greater than the deaths suffered in places like the USA or Great Britain or basically any other combatant. The only combatant that comes close to that on the Allied side was China in terms of suffering. And yet, the Soviet Union managed to bounce back, to drive the Germans from Soviet soil, and ultimately to capture Berlin and end the Nazi regime. It was easily the biggest role played by any of the Allied powers during the Second World War. And in fact, just the other day, there was the anniversary of the Battle of Stalingrad, which of course really spelled the beginning of the end, more than any other battle for that war, and really showed that the tide was turning and the Nazis would be defeated. And in fact, some of the Nazi invaders themselves, talking about the human development of the Soviet Union, they themselves were impressed when they in fact encountered female farm workers who had university degrees and were well versed in subjects from chemistry to geography to, you name it. When they actually encountered that, and they did not believe that they would find that at all. And this is in Western Ukraine and places like that. The invading Germans were actually encountering people, basically just peasants who now were who were literate, who had degrees, who were doing advanced technical jobs. I mean, it was really amazing, this sort of thing. And even they had to admit that they were impressed by that. And another example, of course, in Soviet Central Asia in 1928. So this is in places like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. In 1928, Stalin's first year in power, women in those areas of the world were totally subordinate to men. In a tribal society, that hadn't changed for hundreds of years, they often had to wear the burqa, as many Afghan women do today. They were oppressed. They couldn't really do jobs outside the home, largely confined to the home. Engaged in child rearing. Very, very controlled sort of life, and where they had virtually no freedoms and were virtually subordinate to men's every whim. But of course, by 1953, the year of Stalin's death, the burqa had essentially disappeared from Central Asia. Women had rights. The tribal society that had kept women down had basically been eliminated. Living standards had increased dramatically. Those people now had access to health care and free public education and all manner of kind of social services they had no experience with in the past. And just totally transformed that entire area of the world. So, really, it would be fair to say that the Soviet Union under Stalin's leadership from 1928 to 1953 was perhaps the greatest societal shift and the greatest national transformation in human history. And just the kind of determination, the will that went into transforming the Soviet Union from this backward, oppressed, largely illiterate country that had been exploited for generations by capitalism, by global capitalism, into like this industrial powerhouse that could stand on its own 2 feet and was an example to the world for what socialism could do in terms of developing a country. And made all manner of advances in all areas of society and all walks of life and of living. It really proves the power of Stalin's saying when he said, "I believe in one thing, the power of human will." Because human beings built the Soviet Union and transformed that land from that just oppressed and uneducated and exploited nation into one of the most powerful nations in the world, most developed nations in the world, in the space of a few decades. In the space of about 3 decades, they did that. Like, absolutely amazing. And that should not be minimized. That should be acknowledged. That should be celebrated. You know, the human beings actually were able to better their condition like that and withstand a massive invasion from this tyrannical entity, the Nazi Germany, that wanted to basically destroy all those gains. And yet they failed. And the Soviet Union persevered and just raised itself up again, built itself up again after the Second World War. You know, he's one of the most heroic episodes in human history and speaks a lot to the human spirit and human defiance and human capabilities and human will, as Stalin said. He believed in the power of human will, and rightly so.